At first glance, No One Lives Under the Lighthouse looks like the type of game Steam spits out in droves. It's in first person, there's a candle, and some areas of the game are pitch black. But there's something about it that's undeniably unique. The atmosphere is intoxicating, the soundtrack is used sparingly, and the tone slips between comfortable routine and absolute dread. The previous lighthouse keeper disappeared, and you're the replacement until they can find a new one. With some very brief instructions after the prologue, you're left to your own devices. There's no HUD elements, there's no objective markers, and no tutorials. Despite this, I never got stuck, and I always knew what I had to do next. When a lot of modern games treat their players like they'd be unable to open a child-proof bottle, it's not hard to see why there's nostalgia for a time when games were cryptic and mysterious. It's actually quite refreshing to play something that believes you're capable of identifying and solving problems on your own, and it's in this impressive restraint that the game really shines. I beat the game in only 96 minutes, and I was content with the ending. It was an intelligent, subtle piece of horror. I looked at a few Steam reviews, and to my surprise, they all seemed to describe different scenarios and different gameplay events. More than just a different cosmetic ending, their games had completely different stories. I've now played through the game twice, and whilst my first playthrough may have been quiet and thought-provoking, my second was nerve-shredding. When you don't push people in any clear direction, they seem to end up doing what they feel they should, or perhaps just whatever they want. By giving no tutorials and no clear action of what to do next, the player is forced to make a choice. Your behavior receives the events that are the most fitting to you. Remember, I played through this game twice, and I still don't know what half these story achievements could be referring to. I have a memory of the way games used to be, before you could watch all of their cutscenes on YouTube the day it came out. Every game was engulfed in a tangible mystery. There were rumors that if you did a certain thing at a certain time, you might get a mind-blowing outcome. No One Lives Under the Lighthouse gives me this feeling again, that there's something I'm missing, that there's still something under the surface that I haven't yet scratched. This is that cryptic mystery I was talking about. The hand that guides the player is invisible. It's not an easy task to design a game that's tightly focused, but also feels free-flowing and organic. Ideally, you want players to feel as though they've discovered some secret path forward, when they've actually done exactly what you've wanted them to. Lighthouse, at least in my opinion, emulates the design philosophy of these old games perfectly. A lot of horror is focused on physical brutality, a killer hiding in the bushes or a ghost haunting your holiday home. These things are all great for thrills, and I've talked about games that utilize them perfectly previously. But my key interest in this genre is psychology. When horror is at its best, it's a deep and intimate exploration of the darker side inherent to the human condition. Inspired by the films of David Lynch, Football Game succeeds in producing that anxious feeling in your stomach. You play as Tommy, star of his high school football team. The big game is on tonight, and Tom can't wait to win the day and afterwards spend the night with his ditzy cheerleader sweetheart. Needless to say, things don't quite go according to plan. On the gameplay end, Football Game is a well-made point-and-click with engaging puzzles. All of the solutions are reasonable, and some of them are actually rather clever. The world that the game inhabits feels functional and real, which makes the events that much more difficult to ignore. There's a lot to unpack, scored by a moody soundtrack and atmosphere you could cut with a knife. It's too dark to be a traditional drama, and it doesn't beat you over the head with lazy jump scares. Creeping unease, and the feeling of being dragged towards something you don't want to see but desperately need. Maybe we're reaching an impasse, where games like this are given some new classification of horror. Football Game doesn't ever really try to scare the player, just disturb and possibly upset them. There's something to be said about the longevity that comes from this type of experience. For example, jump scares inherently make the viewer feel safe. Let's say you're watching a horror movie. There's prolonged silence, which builds anticipation. Eventually, once the anticipation reaches its peak, there's a loud noise and something jumps at the camera, triggering an unavoidable physiological response. And what's the first thing a lot of people do after a jump scare like this? They laugh. They look at the people around them and they share a good giggle at how silly it was for them to jump at a movie. You remember it fondly as a good time with your mates, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a large subsection of horror that has an opposing goal. Football game is unlikely to leave anyone laughing. The few hours of playtime have an encroaching feeling of dread, and the ending gives off an empty and sickening feeling. It's the sort of thing that just leaks back into your mind while making coffee a week later. You probably already know if this is the sort of game that interests you or not, so to those few I give a warm recommendation. Prototype Mansion Used No Cover is a tongue-in-cheek tribute to the original Resident Evil. It's not going to scare you, and it's not going to try. But, unlike most parody games, it doesn't rely solely on its jokes, and it manages to maintain the core gameplay of the genre. Every enemy has a set amount of bullets that you'll need to subtract from the amount of ammo you're willing to expend, ensuring that you're always short on something. The gunplay itself is satisfying, and it can get surprisingly tense at times. The game has its own lore and story disparate of Resident Evil, but deliberately covers many of the same areas and story beats. The voice acting is competent, and unfortunately doesn't carry the original's glory.
I'm getting less keen on this place by the minute, Hank. Where are you?
I'm in the basement and it's crawling with baddies down here. You found what you're looking for yet?
There was some kid calling the front desk earlier. I think she's locked up upstairs.
There must be a back door somewhere. Let's try to find it first, shall we? Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
The first Resident Evil rests in a weird space where it appears to be appreciated equally for its success and failings combined. Serious moments like the infamous itchy tasty note and the dogs suddenly crashing through the window are still praised today, much to the confusion of Zoomers. The dialogue and voice acting are also praised, but for a very different reason.
Now, there are a lot of rooms in that mansion that we can't get into because they're locked up.
It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
The combination of genuine fright and genuine laughter creates an odd atmosphere. It's almost comfortable balancing between the two extremes. I won't go as far as to say that the humor is integral to the experience, but I doubt you'd find anyone that argues Resident Evil would have been better off with more traditional voice acting. It's a deep appreciation of this style of humor that makes Prototype Mansion stand out from its peers. It retains the balancing act of weird comedy and genuinely tense combat and packages it into 2 games. Even if you haven't played the original RE, I'd recommend them anyway. The visuals are an excellent bow on top, making everything sort of comfy. It also helps that the sequel has possibly the greatest name I've ever heard, Garden Variety Body Horror. I doubt anyone will be racking up hundreds of hours into this or its sequel, but they make for a nice way to spend a night or two.